He's already gone, Vanessa. We just need him to sign before he figures it out. That was my son's voice, coming through a Bluetooth speaker I didn't know was still connected to his phone in my kitchen. On a Tuesday morning 11 days before our family reunion, while I stood 4 feet away holding a box of fishing lures I was about to pack into the truck, the speaker kept playing. A dishwasher hummed somewhere in his house 2 states away, oblivious, mechanical, indifferent to what was being said over it. I did not move. I did not drop the box. I stood there in my own kitchen, in the house I built with my own hands the summer after I married Eleanor, and I listened to my only son talk about me the way you'd talk about a lease that needed to be terminated. Vanessa's voice came back thin and tinny through the little speaker. He still thinks he's hosting this year. He's already emailed the caterer twice. Let him, Daniel said. Let him think he's in charge until Saturday. It's easier that way. I set the box of lures down on the counter very slowly, the way you set down something you're afraid might go off if it's jostled. The speaker kept humming its little blue light. Somewhere down the hall, the grandfather clock Eleanor's father gave us on our wedding day ticked through the silence like it was counting something down. I am a man who has read 10,000 property deeds in his life. I know how to find the sentence buried on page 4 that changes who owns what. I did not need a second reading to understand what I had just heard. My own son had just called me already gone, like a house already sold, like a signature already collected. My name is Walter Hines. I am 63 years old. For 31 years I worked as a property title examiner, the kind of job nobody thinks about until something goes wrong with a piece of land they thought was theirs. I have spent my whole career finding the lie hidden in a stack of paperwork that looks perfectly clean on top. I never once imagined I would need those skills inside my own family. This is not the story I expected to be telling you today. I was supposed to be packing a truck for our family reunion at Hines Landing, the lake house I built plank by plank the year Eleanor and I got married, the house where we raised Daniel, the house where every summer for 38 years the whole family has gathered on the same dock to watch the sun go down and eat off the same chipped blue plates my mother left me. I was supposed to be worrying about whether we had enough charcoal. Instead, I was standing in my kitchen, with my hand pressed flat against the counter, listening to my son's voice through a speaker he forgot was still paired, learning that somewhere in the last few months, without my knowledge, an entirely different plan had been built underneath the one I thought I was running. If you're just joining me, let me tell you where I'm starting from before I tell you how I dismantled what they built behind my back. Let me know in the comments where you're watching from tonight. Every family has its rituals, the little repeated gestures that hold everything together without anyone noticing they're doing the holding. Ours was Hines Landing, 240 acres, 40 of them lakefront, a house I built at 29 with a hammer, a level, and a stubbornness Eleanor used to say she both loved and wanted to strangle out of me. Every July since 1988, the whole family has come. Cousins, in-laws, the grandkids now. 31 years of the same reunion, and I have hosted every single one because the house is mine, paid for outright, deeded free and clear, the one piece of ground on this earth that nobody can take a percentage of. I should tell you something about myself before I go further, because it matters for what comes later. I do not handle crowds the way I used to. 3 years ago, Eleanor died in a hospital room with fluorescent lights that hummed at a pitch I still hear sometimes in grocery stores. Since then, there are certain sounds that put me somewhere I don't want to be. The particular squeak of rubber-soled shoes on linoleum, a certain register of overlapping voices in a waiting room. I have gotten very good at slipping out of rooms before anyone notices I've gone still, and very good at explaining it away as needing air. Nobody in my family knows this about me. I have never told them, because I built my whole life on being the steady one, the one who doesn't need anything, and I was not about to start needing something now, 3 years too late for anyone to fix it. I finished packing the truck alone that Tuesday, the way I do most things now. Cooler, tarps, the folding tables from the shed, the good tablecloths Eleanor kept in the cedar chest. My hands did the work my brain had done 1,000 times without needing to think about it. while the rest of my mind kept turning over those 11 words. He's already gone, Vanessa. We just need him to sign before he figures it out. Sign what? That was the question that wouldn't sit still in me. I am not a paranoid man. 31 years reading title records teaches you the difference between a coincidence and a pattern. And I told myself, standing there in the driveway with the truck half loaded, that I did not yet have enough to call this a pattern. I had 11 words and a bad feeling. The bad feeling got worse 3 days later. My grandson Charlie is 8 years old, and he is the only person left in this family who has never learned to perform for anyone. He has his grandmother's eyes, the same pale gray-green, and when he looks at you, he is actually looking, not waiting for his turn to talk. That Friday, Daniel and Vanessa dropped him off at my place for the weekend, the way they've done every few weeks since Eleanor passed, because Charlie likes fishing with me, and I like the 2 days a month where the house doesn't feel so much like a museum. We were down at my dock that evening, just the two of us, rigging up a bobber for him. When he went quiet in that particular way, kids go quiet right before they say something they've been carrying around too heavy for their pockets. "Grandpa," he said, not looking up from the fishing line. "Mom and Dad had a meeting at our house on Tuesday with a man in a suit. They told me to stay upstairs." I kept my hands steady on the reel. "That's so. I heard some of it through the vent." He was quiet a second, working a knot loose with small, stubborn fingers. "They kept saying your name a lot." I did not push him. 8-year-olds tell you more if you let the silence do the work instead of your questions. I clipped the bobber onto his line and handed him the rod, and after a while, without me asking anything at all, he said the sentence that has not left me since, the sentence I will hear for the rest of my life whenever I smell lake water and pine. "Grandpa," he whispered, "even though there was nobody within 100 yards of us to overhear, they changed the plan because of you." I looked down at him. He was watching his bobber, not me, the way kids do when they're saying something too big to say while making eye contact. "What plan, buddy?" "I don't know exactly," he said. "But Dad said something about a doctor coming to the reunion, and Mom said we shouldn't tell you until after because you'd get upset and ruin everything." He finally looked up at me, and there was something in his face that no 8-year-old should have to carry, a kind of guilty, frightened loyalty, torn between the parents who fed him and the grandfather who taught him to tie a clinch knot. I wasn't supposed to say anything. "Please don't tell them I told you." I promised him I wouldn't. It is possibly the only promise I have ever made that I intend to keep no matter what it costs me, because that boy trusted me with something that could get him in trouble, and I will not be the reason he learns that honesty gets punished in this family. But I want you to understand what those 2 sentences did to me, sitting there on a dock at sunset with a fishing rod in my hand and my grandson's small shoulder pressed against my arm. A doctor, coming to the reunion, not to check on me out of kindness, coming deliberately, on a day I would be surrounded by every relative I have, unable to leave, unable to make a scene, cornered in the one place I have never once felt cornered in my life. I have read enough guardianship filings in my career. They cross a title examiner's desk more often than people realize. Whenever an incompetent owner's property changes hands, to know exactly what that kind of doctor visit means when it's arranged quietly, at a family gathering, without the subject's knowledge. It means someone is building a paper trail. It means someone wants a signature or a diagnosis, and they've decided the easiest way to get either one is to catch you off guard, surrounded by people who love you, so you won't cause a scene. I sat on that dock a long time after Charlie went in for dinner. The sun went down orange behind the far tree line the way it has every summer of my adult life, and I thought about the deed to this land sitting in a safe deposit box, 40 minutes from here, sole owner, Walter James Hines, a piece of paper nobody could touch without my signature. Nobody could touch it, unless, of course, they decided I was no longer competent to hold it. I want to tell you that my first instinct was rage. It wasn't. My first instinct, the 131 years of reading fraudulent paperwork trained into me before anything else, was to go get the file. I went inside, and while Charlie ate his dinner at the counter, telling me about a video game I only half listened to, I went to the small fireproof box I keep in my study closet, the one Eleanor used to tease me about, calling it my doomsday kit. Inside it was the deed to Hines Landing, the trust documents I'd set up 3 years ago, right after Eleanor died, on the advice of a lawyer friend who told me, gently, that a widowed man with valuable property and one adult child should always protect himself, not because he distrusts his family, but because grief makes people do things they'd never otherwise consider, and money makes grief worse. I had listened to him. I had put Hines Landing into an irrevocable trust, with myself as the lifetime beneficiary, and a specific clause, one I remembered writing with a kind of grim, hopeful sadness, believing I would never need it. The property cannot be sold, transferred, mortgaged, or removed from the trust without my personal, notarized, witness consent, given while of sound mind as certified by 2 independent physicians of my own choosing, not physicians selected by any other party. 3 years ago I had written a lock into my own front door, hoping I'd never have to test whether it held. Now I sat at my kitchen table with Charlie's video game chatter as background noise, and I read that clause 4 times, and for the first time in 11 days I felt something other than dread. I felt the particular, cold, professional calm of a man who has just realized the trap someone built for him has a hole in it they don't know about, but a locked door doesn't tell you who's trying to get in, or why, or how far they're willing to go. I needed more than a clause. I needed to know exactly what my son and daughter-in-law had built, and I needed proof, real proof, the kind that holds up in a room full of people, because I already understood something in my gut that would take me another week to confirm on paper. This had not started with Daniel. I have known my son for 35 years. He is careless with money, and quick to anger, and, if I am honest with myself in a way I was not honest for most of his childhood, he has always needed someone else's plan to follow rather than the patience to build his own. He is many things. He has never once, in his entire life, been the one who plans 4 steps ahead. That is not a criticism I am proud of making about my own child, but it is the truth, and the truth was the only thing that was going to get me through the next 11 days. Someone else built this plan. Daniel was just the one saying the words. I called Charlie's bedtime a little early that night, tucked him in the same room his father slept in as a boy, and sat for a long while in the dark hallway outside the door, listening to him breathe, thinking about the promise I'd made him. Then I went back to my study, turned on the desk lamp, and did the only thing I have ever really known how to do when the ground under me turns out to be less solid than I thought. I started pulling records. By midnight I had found 3 things that made my hands go cold, in a way the lake air outside never could. The first was a business registration filed 4 months earlier in the state of Ohio, a limited liability company called Lakeside Family Holdings, with Vanessa listed as the registered agent and Daniel as the sole member. The second was a notice of default on a small business loan Vanessa had taken out 2 years ago for a boutique she'd opened and quietly closed within a year, a debt of just under $90,000 that I had never once heard mentioned at a single family dinner. The third was the one that made me set down my reading glasses and just sit in the silence of my own study for a long time before I could pick them back up. An appraisal request, filed with a local firm 8 weeks earlier, for a parcel of lakefront land matching Hines Landing's exact legal description, requesting a valuation to be used, according to the form, for estate planning purposes. They had already priced my home, before they'd ever mentioned a word of it to me, before a single doctor had ever laid eyes on me. They already knew what my life's work was worth on paper, down to the acre. I sat back in my chair and I thought about Eleanor, the way I still do most nights. And I thought about the sentence Charlie had whispered on the dock. They changed the plan because of you, and something in me that had been quietly grieving for 3 years, going still in waiting rooms, slipping out of loud gatherings, suddenly stopped being quiet at all. I am not a violent man. I have never raised my hand to anyone in my life, and I was not about to start with my own son. But I have spent 3 decades learning that the most dangerous person in any room is not the one who's shouting. It's the one quietly reading the fine print while everyone else is arguing over who gets the good chair on the dock. 11 days until the reunion. 11 days until, according to my 8-year-old grandson, a doctor was going to show up at the one place on this earth that has never once belonged to anyone but me, and try to convince a room full of people I love that I no longer belong there either. I picked up the phone that night, and I called the one person who had helped me build that lock 3 years ago, the lawyer who had told me grief makes people do things they'd never otherwise consider. His name is Marcus Whitfield, and he answered on the second ring, even though it was well past 11 at night, because in 30 years of friendship, I had never once called him after 9 unless something was badly wrong. "Walter," he said, "what happened? I need you to tell me everything a family can and can't do," I said, "if they've decided their father isn't fit to hold his own deed anymore." There was a long pause on the line, the sound of a man setting down whatever he'd been holding. "Start from the beginning," he said. "Don't leave anything out." So I told him. The speaker, the word gone, the Dr. Charlie overheard being arranged, the LLC, the default notice, the appraisal. Marcus listened without interrupting, which is one of the things I have always valued most in him, and when I finished, he was quiet for a moment before he spoke again, and when he did, his voice had the particular flatness of a man choosing his words with great care, because he doesn't like what they mean. "Walter," he said, "I need you to understand something clearly before we go any further, because what you're describing, if it's what I think it is, has a name and the name matters. This isn't just a family being cruel to you. If they're arranging an unannounced psychiatric evaluation at a gathering without your knowledge or consent, with the intent of using the results to challenge your competency and gain control of a protected asset, that is the early architecture of a conservatorship petition. That is a legal process, Walter. That is not a family squabble anymore. That is something a judge can be asked to rule on." I sat with that word for a long moment. Conservatorship. I had read the word 100 times in old title files, always about someone else, some stranger whose name meant nothing to me, some elderly owner whose family had decided, for reasons good or terrible, that he could no longer be trusted with his own signature. I had never once imagined it would be my name typed into that kind of document, my own son's name listed as the petitioner. "Can they do it?" I asked. "Without any real cause?" "They can file a petition claiming almost anything," Marcus said. "Filing isn't the hard part. Winning is. A judge needs real evidence of incapacity, not a family's convenience. And if they're leaning on some doctor they hand-picked who's never treated you and has no medical history to draw from, that's exactly the kind of shortcut that falls apart under real scrutiny, if someone's prepared to fight it properly." He paused. "Are you prepared to fight it properly, Walter?" I looked down at the appraisal request sitting on my desk, at the LLC filing with my daughter-in-law's name on it, at the debt notice for a business she'd never once mentioned in 3 years of holiday dinners, and I thought about a small boy whispering a secret on a dock, because he loved me more than he was afraid of getting caught. "I built that house with my own hands," I said. "I am not signing anything, and I am not letting some stranger with a clipboard tell a room full of people, I love that I don't know my own name, Then here's what we're going to do," Marcus said, and for the next hour and 40 minutes, sitting in my study with the desk lamp throwing a small circle of light across the deed to Hines Landing, my old friend and I built the beginning of a plan that had nothing to do with fishing lures or folding tables and everything to do with making sure that when the family gathered on my dock in 11 days, the only person leaving that reunion with a signature on anything was going to be me. The days between that phone call and the reunion moved the way days move when you're waiting for a storm you can already see on the horizon, too slow and too fast at the same time, every ordinary task suddenly carrying a second, heavier meaning underneath it. Marcus worked fast. Within 48 hours, he had pulled the full business records on Lakeside Family Holdings, and what he found confirmed something I had already begun to suspect in the cold hours after midnight, sitting alone with that appraisal request in my hands. The LLC wasn't Daniel's idea. It had been filed by a paralegal at a firm 2 counties over, a firm that, according to the State Bar Directory, specialized almost exclusively in elder guardianship petitions. The filing fee had been paid from an account that traced back not to Daniel's name, but to Vanessa's. I want to be careful here, because I loved my son before any of this, and some small, stubborn part of me still does. But I had spent 35 years watching Daniel drift toward whoever in a room had the clearest plan, the loudest certainty, and I understood. Sitting at my kitchen table with Marcus's notes spread out in front of me, that I was not looking at a son who had turned against his father out of greed. I was looking at a son who had been quietly, patiently steered. The business Vanessa had opened and closed within a year, a boutique selling handmade candles and imported linens in a strip mall outside Columbus, had left her almost $90,000 in debt. Debt she had never once mentioned to me. Debt that, according to the default notice Marcus had pulled, was now 4 months past its final grace period, with the lender threatening to place a lien against the only real asset in her and Daniel's name, their house. I sat with that for a long while. A woman drowning in a debt she'd hidden from her own husband's father for 2 years, staring across the table at a man whose lake house alone was worth more than 8 times what she owed, a man who had already, as far as she knew, no formal plan for what happened to that property when he was gone. It did not excuse anything. I want to say that clearly, because I have had moments this past week where some old, tired part of me wanted to find a reason to forgive it before it had even finished happening. Desperation explains a great deal. It does not make a lie into anything other than a lie, and it did not make the word gone, said about me, into anything other than what it was, but it told me who I was really up against, and that mattered because it meant the plan Marcus and I were building needed 2 different strategies. Not one, a legal wall solid enough to stop a conservatorship petition cold, and a way to make sure that when the truth came out, it came out in a way that let my son see clearly, for the first time in 2 years, exactly whose hand had been on the wheel the whole time. On Wednesday, 4 days before the reunion, I drove into town and did something I have not done since I retired 11 years ago. I put on a collared shirt, and I went to see Dr. Alan Reyes, a physician I have trusted for over 20 years, a man who delivered my grandson and set my wrist when I broke it falling off a ladder repainting the boathouse. I told him everything, not as a patient reporting symptoms, but as an old friend asking for a favor that mattered. I need a formal cognitive evaluation, I told him, sitting in his office at the end of his last appointment of the day. Full battery, memory, reasoning, the works. I want it dated, signed, notarized, and I want 2 copies. Alan looked at me over his glasses for a long moment. Walter, you don't need this. I've known you 20 years. There's nothing wrong with your mind. I know that, I said. But somebody's arranging for a stranger to walk into my family's reunion and tell everyone there might be. I'd like to already have the truth in writing before they get the chance to invent a different one. He didn't ask any more questions after that. 2 hours later, I walked out of his office with the beginning of the wall Marcus and I needed, a clean bill of cognitive health from my own physician of 20 years, dated 4 days before anyone else's hired doctor would ever set foot on my property. That was the legal wall. The other piece, the piece that still makes something twist in my chest even now, was smaller, and it fit in the breast pocket of a flannel shirt. Eleanor gave me a pen for our 30th anniversary. Nothing fancy, a slim brass fountain pen, the kind you could refill 100 times, engraved along the barrel with 4 words. Still writing our story. She used to tease me that I never used it for anything important enough, that I kept it in a drawer instead of carrying it, saving it, the way I saved everything good, for some later day that never quite arrived. After she died, I started carrying it everywhere, in whatever shirt I happened to be wearing, because it was the last thing her hands had chosen just for me, and because some foolish, grieving part of me believed that if I carried it close enough, some piece of her came along with it. I am not a man who is comfortable with gadgets, but I called my nephew Ray, who works in security systems, and I asked him a question I never imagined I'd need to ask about my own life. He came by that Thursday with a small case and showed me how to fit a tiny digital recorder inside the pen's cap without changing its weight or its shape enough for anyone who'd known it for years to notice. It still wrote, it still felt, in my hand like the last gift my wife ever gave me. It also now had a battery life of 11 hours and enough memory to hold every word anyone said near me for the length of an entire reunion weekend. I did not do this lightly. I sat on the porch that Thursday evening with the pen in my hand, turning it over in the fading light, and I thought about what it meant that the object I loved most in this world, the last physical piece of my marriage, was about to become the instrument that caught my own son in a lie. Eleanor would have hated the reason. I think she would have understood the necessity. She always did understand, better than I ever gave her credit for while she was alive. That love and protection were not always gentle things. Friday, the day before the reunion, Charlie called me himself, using his mother's phone. His voice is small and careful the way it gets when he's been told not to say too much. "Grandpa, are you excited for tomorrow?" "Very excited, buddy," I told him, and it wasn't entirely a lie. I was excited to see him. I was excited for very little else. Dad said Uncle Ferris is coming this year too, and a friend of his. Dad's friend, he said the friend is a doctor, but he's not going to say that part out loud. He's just going to say he's a friend from work. A pause, the particular silence of a child working up his courage. "You're not going to get in trouble for the fishing thing, are you?" "I don't want you to get in trouble." My chest ached in a way I have not let myself feel fully since Eleanor's funeral. "Nobody's getting in trouble, Charlie," I said. "I promise you that. Whatever happens tomorrow, you did exactly the right thing, and I need you to know that no matter what you hear people say tomorrow, that's still going to be true on Monday." He didn't fully understand what I meant, and I didn't explain it to him, because an 8-year-old should not have to carry the weight of knowing his father is about to be caught in a lie in front of 30 relatives. But he seemed to hear something steady in my voice, and he said, "Okay," in the small, relieved way kids do when an adult has told them the world is still going to make sense tomorrow. And we talked about fishing for another 5 minutes before his mother's voice called him away from the phone. "I want to tell you something honest here, something I have not said out loud to anyone, not even Marcus. That Friday night, alone in the house Eleanor and I built, the night before what I already understood was going to be the hardest reunion of my life, I sat in her old rocking chair for the first time in 3 years. I had not been able to sit in that chair since the week she died. I would walk past it a dozen times a day, dust it, straighten the cushion, and never once lower myself into it, because some part of me was certain that if I sat down where she used to sit, I would finally have to feel the whole size of what I'd lost, all at once, with nothing left to distract me. I have let myself believe these past 3 years that staying busy, staying steady, being the reliable one who never needed comforting, was a kind of strength. Sitting there that Friday night, with a hidden recorder in my shirt pocket and a doctor's letter in my desk drawer, and my own son's voice still echoing in my memory, calling me already gone, I understood something about myself that I had been avoiding for 3 years. I had not been strong. I had been hiding the same way I hide in loud rooms, the same way I slip out before anyone notices I've gone still. I had built an entire second life around never needing anything from anyone, and somewhere in that armor, without meaning to, I had let my own son grow into a man who genuinely believed his father could be signed away like a piece of unwanted property, because I had spent 3 years teaching everyone around me, without a single word, that I did not need to be asked. I sat in Eleanor's chair a long time that night. I let myself cry, which I had also not properly done since the funeral, and when I finally stood up, stiff and hollow and strangely lighter, I understood that whatever happened tomorrow, some of what had gone wrong in this family was not only Daniel's doing. I had left a door open too, just not the one they were trying to walk through. Saturday morning came in gray and warm, the lake fogged over the way it gets in late July, before the sun burns through around 9. I was up before dawn, the way I always am on reunion day, and I went through the motions of hosting with the same practiced hands I've used for 38 years. Coffee on, folding tables set up along the dock, the good tablecloths from Eleanor's cedar chest smoothed down against the morning damp. Cars started arriving around 10, my brother Ferris and his wife first, then cousins I see only once a year, their kids running straight for the water, the way children always do, the moment tires stopped crunching on gravel. I greeted every single one of them exactly the way I always have. Because whatever was coming, I was not going to let this family's last ordinary morning be anything other than ordinary. Daniel and Vanessa arrived just before 11, with Charlie in the back seat and a man I didn't recognize riding up front, a stranger in his 50s wearing a golf shirt and khakis, carrying himself with the careful pleasantness of someone who has been coached on exactly how to seem harmless. "Dad," Daniel said, coming up the porch steps with a smile that did not reach anywhere near his eyes. "This is Greg. Old buddy of mine from the Rotary thing. Hope it's okay he tagged along. He's between places this weekend." I shook Greg's hand. It was soft and a little too eager, the handshake of a man used to putting people at ease before he does something they won't like. "Happy to have you," I said, and I meant every word of it, in a way Daniel could not possibly have understood. Charlie caught my eye over his father's shoulder, and for just a moment something passed between us, a small nod, a promise kept and about to be honored, and then he ran off toward the dock with his cousins, and I turned back to my son and the woman beside him, and the pleasant, harmless-looking stranger they had brought to my home, and I smiled the way I have smiled at 1,000 closing tables across 31 years, the smile of a man who already knows exactly what's written on every page of the file in front of him. "Well," I said, "the grill's not going to light itself. Let's get this reunion started." The day moved the way every reunion day moves at Heinz Landing. Burgers and corn on the grill, kids screaming off the end of the dock into water still cold enough in July to make them gasp, the low murmur of 30 relatives catching each other up on a year's worth of small news. I played my part in all of it. I flipped burgers. I let my great-niece show me a cartwheel 4 separate times. I stood at the edge of the water, with a beer I barely touched, and let the ordinary noise of my family wash over me. And underneath every single minute of it, the pen sat in my breast pocket, quietly recording, and I waited. Greg didn't rush it. I'll give him that. He spent the early afternoon being pleasant, being harmless, asking easy questions of whoever sat down near him. "How long has the family had this place? Must be a lot of memories here. Your father built all this himself." The kind of questions that sound like small talk and are actually reconnaissance. I watched him work the crowd the way you watch a man you already know is holding a knife behind his back, waiting to see which direction he'll turn. Around 3, with most of the family scattered along the shoreline or dozing in lawn chairs after lunch, Daniel found me at the grill, alone the way I'd known he would. "Dad," he said, "you got a minute?" Greg's actually got some background in geriatric care, and Vanessa and I have just been a little worried about you, living out here alone, and we thought maybe he could just check in with you. Nothing formal. Just a friendly conversation. I turned the last of the burgers over, unhurried. "Geriatric care," I repeated. "Interesting friend to bring to a family reunion, Daniel." Something flickered across his face, gone almost before I caught it. "It's nothing, Dad. Just humor us, okay? 20 minutes. In the study." I set down the spatula, and I looked at my son for a long moment, long enough that some old instinct in him, some part of him that still remembered what it was like to be 9 years old and caught in a lie, made him glance away first. "All right," I said. "The study. Give me 5 minutes." I walked into the house alone, and I stood for a moment in the front hall, my hand resting on the newel post I'd carved myself the year Daniel was born, and I let myself feel, one last time, exactly how much I did not want to do what I was about to do. Then I went to the study, unlocked the bottom drawer of my desk, and took out the folder Marcus and I had prepared. Dr. Reyes's evaluation, the trust documents, copies of the LLC filing, and the appraisal request, and the default notice. Everything laid out in the plain damning order 31 years of reading other people's paperwork had taught me to arrange it in. I set the folder on the desk, closed but ready, and I sat down in my chair to wait. They came in together, Daniel, Vanessa, and Greg, with the study door easing shut behind them the way doors close when people want privacy for something they already know is going to be uncomfortable. Vanessa's face had a brightness to it that didn't sit right on her, a hostess smile stretched a size too wide. "Walter, thank you for doing this," she said, settling into the chair across from my desk like she'd rehearsed the angle of it. We just love you so much, and we've noticed some little things lately, and we want to make sure you're okay out here. That's all this is. I let the silence sit a moment before I answered. Out on the lake, faint through the window, I could hear my grandson laughing at something one of his cousins had said, an ordinary, beautiful sound, entirely unaware of what was happening 30 feet away. Little things, I said. Go on. I'd like to hear them. Vanessa glanced at Daniel, who cleared his throat and looked, for one unguarded second, like a much younger man than he was. You've seemed distracted, Dad, forgetful, and living out here by yourself, it's a lot of land to manage, a lot of house. We just think it might be time to start talking about what makes sense long term, I said. For everyone, Vanessa added smoothly. For the family. This place should stay in the family, Walter. We just want to make sure it's protected, properly structured, so nothing happens to it. There it was, the sentence I'd been waiting 11 days to hear spoken out loud, dressed up in exactly the soft, caring language I'd known it would wear. Protected. Structured. I thought of the appraisal request sitting 8 weeks old in my desk drawer, of a doctor's visit arranged behind my back and disguised as a friendly conversation, of my grandson whispering a warning on a dock because he was the only one in this room who hadn't yet learned to talk this carefully. Greg, I said, turning to him directly for the first time since he'd sat down, why don't you tell me exactly what kind of evaluation you're here to perform? He didn't flinch, which told me he was better at this than Daniel was. Just an informal assessment, Walter. Nothing clinical. A conversation about memory, orientation, that sort of thing, purely to help the family understand your current needs. And if this informal conversation, I said, happened to produce some notes, some observations, would those notes by any chance end up attached to a legal filing sometime in the next few months? A petition, say. The kind a court might use to decide who's allowed to hold a deed. The room went very still. Out on the lake, the laughter carried on, oblivious, and somewhere down the hall the grandfather clock ticked through the silence, the way it had on the day I first overheard my son's voice through a forgotten speaker. I don't know what you're talking about, Daniel said. But his voice had lost its footing, and I watched something close behind his eyes, the particular look of a man realizing the ground he'd been standing on was never as solid as he'd been told. I reached into my breast pocket and set the pen down on the desk between us, cap up, and I told them plainly what it was and what it had recorded for the last 4 hours, and I watched the color leave my son's face by degrees. The way water leaves a low place in the ground once you finally find the crack that was draining it all along. He's already gone, Vanessa. We just need him to sign before he figures it out. I said it back to him in my own voice, calm, level, the exact words he had spoken about me 11 days earlier in my own kitchen, and I watched him understand in real time that I had been carrying that sentence with me every single hour since. You said that about me, Daniel. In my own house, on a call you forgot was still connected to a speaker. Your mother would have. I stopped myself there because I was about to invoke Eleanor's memory as a weapon, and some part of me still could not do that to her, even in defense of myself. Vanessa could. That was the difference between us, and it was the moment I finally understood, without any doubt, exactly whose hand had been steering this from the start. Oh, don't bring Eleanor into this, she snapped. The hostess' smile finally gone, something harder and more tired showing underneath it. She's not here to guilt anyone anymore, Walter. This isn't about her. It's about a piece of land sitting empty most of the year, while an old man plays house alone in it, and a family that could actually use what it's worth. The room went colder than the lake water outside. Daniel flinched at his wife's words. Actually flinched, a small, involuntary motion. I don't think he even noticed himself making, and in that flinch I saw, for the first time in 11 days, my son as something other than a villain. I saw a man who had been carried along by someone else's current so long he'd forgotten there had ever been a shore. $90,000, I said quietly, looking at Vanessa now, not Daniel. That's what the boutique cost you, isn't it? The one you never once mentioned at a single Thanksgiving. The lender's about to put a lien on your house, and instead of telling your husband the truth, you filed an LLC in his name, hired a firm that specializes in guardianship petitions, and brought a hired doctor to my grandson's family reunion, disguised as your husband's old friend. Vanessa's face went white, and then, a heartbeat later, furious. The particular fury of someone caught holding exactly the thing they'd sworn they weren't carrying. You don't know anything about my life, she said. I know title records, I said. I've spent 31 years reading the sentence on page 4 that changes who owns what. I found your default notice in about 20 minutes, Vanessa. I imagine a judge would find it just as quickly. Daniel had gone very quiet, staring at the recorder pen on the desk like it might still be running, which it was. Van, he said slowly, you told me it was your idea to protect the property. You said Dad wanted this, that he'd talk to you about wanting to simplify things before he got older. Daniel, you said he wanted this. His voice cracked on the word wanted, and I watched 35 years of my son's life rearrange itself behind his eyes in the space of about 4 seconds, watched him understand, the way I had understood 11 days earlier standing in my kitchen with a box of fishing lures, that the ground he'd been standing on had never once been what he was told it was. I let that silence sit for a moment, because some things a man has to hear in his own voice before they become real to him, and then I opened the folder on my desk and set it, unhurried, in the middle of the table where all 3 of them could see it. Here is what actually exists, I said. A cognitive evaluation from Dr. Alan Reyes, dated 4 days ago, stating in no uncertain terms that I am of entirely sound mind. A trust established 3 years ago that makes this property untouchable without my personal, notarized consent, evaluated by physicians of my own choosing, and a recording, 11 days old now, of my son telling my daughter-in-law that his father was already gone and that they only needed him to sign before he figured it out. I closed the folder. I figured it out, Daniel. I'm sorry it had to be your son who told me instead of you. Greg had gone very quiet in his chair, the pleasant golf shirt harmlessness draining out of him fast, now that the room had turned into something his fee clearly hadn't covered. He stood, murmured something about needing to check his car, and let himself out of the study with the particular haste of a man who wants to be very far away by the time the shouting starts. There was no shouting. That surprised me more than anything else that day. Vanessa sat very still, her jaw tight, already I think calculating whatever came next. But Daniel put his head down into his hands, right there in the chair across from my desk, and made a sound I had not heard him make since he was 7 years old, and broke his arm falling out of the big oak by the boathouse. A small, raw, unguarded sound. The sound of a grown man realizing all at once how far he had let himself be led from who he actually was. Dad, he said muffled. I don't even remember when this started feeling normal, talking about you like that. I don't know how it got this far. I did not rush to forgive him. I want to be honest with you about that, because I think too many of these stories end with an instant, easy absolution that doesn't reflect how any of this actually feels from the inside. What I felt, sitting across from my son in that study, was not forgiveness. It was grief layered over the older grief I'd been carrying 3 years already. Grief for the version of Daniel I'd raised and the version sitting in front of me now. And underneath all of it, quiet and stubborn, something that might eventually become forgiveness, if he did the work to earn his way back to it. I owe you something too, Daniel, I said. And this was harder to say than anything else that afternoon, harder than reading back his own words to him. I've spent 3 years since your mother died making sure nobody ever had to worry about me, never asking for help, never sitting still long enough for anyone to notice. I wasn't all right. I taught this whole family, without meaning to, that I didn't need anything from anyone. I think somewhere in that silence you decided I must not need you either. That's not an excuse for what you did. But it's not nothing, and I'm not going to pretend my hands are clean in how we got here. He looked up at me then, eyes red, and for just a moment I saw my son at 9 years old again, the boy who used to climb into my lap during thunderstorms because he trusted, absolutely, that nothing could get to him as long as I was there. Vanessa stood abruptly. This is ridiculous, she said. You're going to let a recording made without my consent. This is Ohio, Vanessa, I said quietly. One-party consent state. I looked it up before I ever put that pen in my pocket. It's admissible. Every word. She had no answer for that. She looked at Daniel, waiting for him to rally to her side the way he had for 2 years, and when he didn't, when he just sat there, hollowed out, staring at his own hands, something closed in her face, and she walked out of the study without another word, her heels sharp against the hardwood floor I'd laid myself 30 years before either of them had a claim on this house at all. Daniel didn't follow her. He sat across from me a long time, the two of us alone in the study with the recorder pen and the folder and the long shadows starting to slant through the window as the afternoon wore on. And eventually he asked the question I think he'd been afraid to ask since the moment he walked in. What happens now? I thought about that for a long moment before I answered, because I had spent 11 days planning what I would say to my son if it ever came to this room, and none of the versions I'd rehearsed felt entirely right anymore, now that I'd watched him break in front of me instead of dig in. The trust stays exactly as it is, I said. Heinz Landing isn't going anywhere, and it isn't being sold, structured, or protected by anyone but me, for as long as I'm alive to protect it. That's not a punishment, Daniel. That's just the truth of how it's always been and how it's going to keep being. He nodded slowly, not arguing. As for you and me, I went on, I think we need some time, not forever. I'm not interested in losing my son the same week I found out how far he'd drifted from me. But I need to know the man sitting across from me actually wants his father back, and not just the eventual deed to his father's house. That's going to take longer than one afternoon to prove, and I think you know that. And Charlie, Daniel said, his voice breaking again on his son's name. Please, Dad. Whatever happens with me and Van, don't let this take him away from you too. He loves you more than anything. Charlie, I said, is the only person in this entire family who told me the truth without being asked, without protecting himself, at real risk to himself, because he loves both of us enough to hate watching us lie to each other. Nothing that happened today is ever going to touch what he and I have. If anything, Daniel, that boy is the reason any of this got fixed before it was too late, instead of after. We sat there a while longer, the two of us, not saying much else, while outside the window the reunion carried on without us. Cousins and grandchildren, and the low, easy laughter of a family that mostly didn't yet know how close its center had come to being carved up on paper by people it trusted. Eventually I stood, and Daniel stood with me, and for the first time in longer than I could remember, my son hugged me the way he used to when he was small, not out of habit or obligation, but because he needed to, and I let him, and for just a moment, over his shoulder, through the study window I could see Charlie down on the dock, laughing at something, his whole small body thrown back with the particular unguarded joy only children still have, entirely unaware that he had just saved something none of the adults around him had managed to protect on their own. The reunion didn't end early. That surprised people who ask me about it now. When I tell this story, they expect it to have shattered into pieces the moment Vanessa walked out of that study, but it didn't. We ate dinner as a family that evening, a little quieter than usual, a little more careful with each other, but together on the same dock we'd gathered on for 38 years. Vanessa left before dessert, driving herself back to Ohio alone, and nobody stopped her, and nobody made a scene of her leaving either. Some fractures don't need an audience to finish breaking. I want to tell you honestly that the weeks after the reunion were not a straight line toward healing. They rarely are. Daniel and Vanessa separated within a month, not because of what happened in my study, or not only because of it, but because once the lie between them had been dragged out into daylight, there wasn't enough left underneath it to hold a marriage up. She filed for the divorce herself, in the end, and moved back near her sister in Cincinnati, and I have not spoken to her since, and I don't imagine I will. I don't carry hatred for her. I carry something closer to a tired, sad understanding of how far a person can travel from themselves when they're drowning and too proud to say so out loud. That doesn't undo what she tried to do to me. It just means I've stopped needing to hate her, to feel at peace with how it ended. Daniel and Charlie moved into a smaller place 15 minutes from Heinz Landing that September, close enough that Charlie could keep his same school, close enough, too, that Daniel started coming by on Sunday afternoons, at first stiff and apologetic, unsure of his welcome, And then, slowly, over the months that followed, something closer to the way things used to be before grief and debt and a stranger's bad advice ever found their way into our family. He asked me once, that October, sitting on the porch with a beer he was drinking too slowly, the way a man does when he's working up to something, "Dad, why didn't you just cut me off?" After everything, I would have understood it. I thought about that question for a long time before I answered it, because I owed him an honest answer, not a comfortable one. "Because I've spent 3 years since your mother died being the man who doesn't need anybody," I told him, "and watching what that silence did to you, to us. I finally understood that cutting you off completely would just be me doing the same thing all over again, only louder. Your mother used to say that love isn't the absence of anger. It's what's still standing after the anger's finished passing through. I wanted to see what was still standing between us, Daniel. Turns out there was more than I expected." He didn't have an answer for that. He just nodded and looked out at the lake, and I think that was the moment I finally started to trust that the son sitting beside me wasn't performing contrition for an audience anymore. He was just there, quietly, the way a son is supposed to be. I made one change to the trust that autumn, and I want to tell you about it because I think it matters more than anything I did in that study back in July. I didn't punish Daniel by cutting him out entirely, the way some part of me, in the rawest days right after the reunion, wanted to. Instead, Marcus and I restructured the terms so that Heinz Landing passes, upon my death, into a family trust held jointly for Daniel and Charlie both, with a clear, ironclad provision that the property can never be sold, subdivided, or mortgaged, only lived in and passed down, generation after generation, exactly the way Eleanor and I always meant it to be used. And I opened a separate fund, modest but real, in Charlie's name alone, earmarked for his education, funded quietly, without ceremony, because a boy who tells the truth at real cost to himself at 8 years old, in a family full of adults who'd forgotten how, deserves to know that kind of courage gets rewarded in this world, not just punished for making things complicated. I told him about it myself this past spring, sitting on the same dock where he'd whispered his warning to me the summer before. He didn't fully understand what a trust fund was, not at 9 years old, but he understood the look on my face when I told him, and he understood, I think, that something important had been settled because of something he'd done. "Are you mad I told you?" he asked me, even now, almost a year later, still needing to hear the answer again. "Charlie," I said, "you're the only person in this whole family who never once lied to me. Not that summer, not since. I am never going to be anything but grateful for that, for as long as I live." He grinned at me then, gap-toothed, sunburned, entirely unburdened by anything, the way a child should be, and went back to untangling his fishing line. And I sat there beside him in the late light, and I let myself feel fully, for the first time since Eleanor died, something that wasn't grief and wasn't vigilance and wasn't the particular exhausted steadiness I'd built my whole life around. I let myself feel simply, quietly happy. There is one more thing I have to tell you, and it is the reason I finally decided to share this whole story with strangers on the internet, instead of just carrying it privately the way I carry most things. Going through Eleanor's cedar chest last winter, looking for a tablecloth for Charlie's birthday, I found a letter I had never seen before, tucked into the lining beneath the good linens, dated only a few months before she got sick. It wasn't addressed to me. It was addressed to Daniel, written in her careful, looping handwriting, and it had clearly never been sent. "I want you to always remember," she wrote, "that this house was never really about the wood or the water. It was about your father's hands building something that would still be standing long after his own hands couldn't build anymore. Take care of him the way he's always taken care of all of us, even when he's too stubborn to say he needs it. And take care of this place, not because it's worth money, because it's worth us." I sat with that letter a long time, in the same study where I'd once laid out a folder of evidence against my own son, and I understood, finally, what I had actually been protecting all those 11 days before the reunion. Not a piece of land, not a deed with my name on it, a promise my wife had made in her own hand about exactly what this family was supposed to mean to each other. a promise that had very nearly been sold off by people who forgot, or never learned, how to read what was written underneath the paperwork. I gave the letter to Daniel this past June, on the anniversary of Eleanor's death, and I watched my grown son read his mother's handwriting for the first time, tears running freely down a face that had spent 2 years learning to talk about his own father like a lease that needed terminating. He asked if he could keep it. I told him it had always been his. It just took me 30 years too long to find where she'd hidden it. We had this year's reunion 2 weeks ago. Same dock, same chipped blue plates, same orange sun going down over the same tree line. It's gone down over for 39 summers now. Daniel grilled the burgers this year, the first time he's ever offered. Charlie ran the length of the dock 4 times before anyone could stop him, cannonballing into water that's never once gotten any warmer no matter how many Julies pass over it. And I sat in a folding chair near the water's edge, watching my family, smaller now and truer for it, and I thought about how close I had come, 11 days before the last reunion, to losing every single piece of it to a folder of paperwork. Nobody but me ever bothered to read all the way through. Eleanor used to say that the truth in a family is like the deed to a house. It might sit buried in a drawer for years, untouched, forgotten, while everyone argues over who really owns what, but it's always there. And sooner or later, if you're patient enough and stubborn enough and willing to read all the way to the bottom of the page, somebody finds it. And everything that was built on top of the lie has nowhere left to stand. I am 64 years old now. I have buried a wife, nearly lost a son to somebody else's greed, and learned, at an age when most men think they're done learning anything important, that the steadiest kind of love is the kind that's still willing to sit down at the table with the people who hurt you, once they've finally told you the truth. I still carry that pen in my breast pocket every single day. It doesn't record anything anymore. Ray took the little device back out of it last fall, at my request, because I didn't need it for what it had been built to do anymore. I just need it for what it always was before all of this, the last thing Eleanor's hands ever chose just for mine, still writing our story, exactly the way she promised it would. Long after the summer I almost lost the only house that ever truly held one.